14-year-old Emily Taylor shot her mother, Melissa Taylor, in the head at point-blank range after an argument over a confiscated smartphone in their Miami, Florida home. The violence of the attack was evident from the blood-spattered walls of the family's upscale kitchen, where Melissa's body was discovered by a neighbor who heard the gunshot on the evening of March 7th. According to initial police reports, Emily had attempted to stage the scene as a break-in gone wrong, moving furniture and breaking a window before fleeing to a friend's house with the murder weapon, her father's unregistered handgun. The suburban tranquility of Coral Gables, an affluent enclave known for its Mediterranean-style mansions and tree-lined streets, was shattered by the shocking nature of the crime. A child killing her parent over something as mundane as a disciplinary action. Detective Marcus Johnson arrived at the Taylor residence at 8:45 that evening, immediately noting the incongruities in the staged break-in. The broken glass from the rear patio door had fallen outside rather than inside, suggesting it had been broken from within the house rather than by an intruder. Emily's bedroom appeared meticulously clean compared to the manufactured chaos in other parts of the house, with no signs of the typical teenage disarray one might expect. Most telling was the lack of forced entry at any access point and the still-activated security system, which showed no record of being disabled until police arrival. Detective Johnson, a 23-year veteran of the Miami-Dade Homicide Division with a specialization in domestic homicides, recognized the hallmarks of a crime of passion disguised as something else. This wasn't random. This wasn't a burglary, Johnson would later testify, pointing to the lack of missing valuables and the specific nature of the single gunshot wound. The bullet had entered Melissa Taylor's skull just above the right temple, fired from a distance of less than 12 inches, an execution-style killing that showed both intent and proximity. Blood spatter analysis indicated that Melissa had been seated at the kitchen island, perhaps eating or working, when she was approached from behind by her killer. The victim's smartphone lay next to her body, screen unlocked, displaying a series of increasingly hostile text messages with her daughter regarding a punishment implemented earlier that day. The final message from Emily, sent just 30 minutes before the estimated time of death, read simply, "You'll regret taking my phone away." The affluent Miami suburb where the Taylors lived had experienced only 2 homicides in the previous decade, both drug-related incidents involving non-residents. The community of doctors, lawyers, and business executives who populated the manicured lawns and Mediterranean revival homes of Coral Gables prided themselves on safety and exclusivity. The murder of Melissa Taylor by her own daughter sent ripples of disbelief through neighborhood WhatsApp groups and local social circles, with parents hugging their children tighter and questioning what signs they might be missing in their own homes. The wall of silence that typically surrounds family dysfunction in privileged communities began to crack as neighbors reluctantly shared stories of hearing arguments from the Taylor home, of Emily's increasingly defiant behavior, and of Melissa's struggles as a single mother trying to balance her demanding career as a pediatrician with raising a troubled teenager. Initial interviews with Emily's teachers and classmates painted a picture of a socially isolated but academically gifted student who had recently undergone a personality shift. Emily had maintained a 4.0 grade point average throughout middle school, but had begun skipping classes in her freshman year of high school. Her former friends described a gradual withdrawal into online relationships and an obsession with her smartphone that had intensified over the previous 6 months. School counseling records, obtained later with a court order, revealed 3 disciplinary incidents in the month before the murder, including one verbal altercation with a teacher who had confiscated her phone during class. The technology that connected Emily to a virtual world had become both her emotional crutch and the catalyst for increasing conflict with authority figures, particularly her mother. The weapon used in the murder, a 9mm Glock handgun, belonged to Emily's father, who had left it behind when he moved out 3 years earlier following a contentious divorce. Melissa had kept the gun locked in a bedside safe, the combination to which was her daughter's birthday, a choice that would prove fatally ironic. Ballistics confirmed that the bullet recovered from Melissa's skull matched test fires from the weapon found in Emily's backpack when police apprehended her at her friend's house 2 hours after the murder. The friend, 16-year-old Amber Collins, initially provided Emily with an alibi, claiming they had been together since after school. This alibi would later unravel under the weight of digital evidence that placed Emily at the crime scene at the time of the murder. Evidence that would become central to the case against her. The timeline of events leading up to the shooting revealed a pattern of escalating tensions between mother and daughter. 3 weeks before the murder, Melissa had discovered inappropriate communications between Emily and an older man on social media, leading to stricter phone usage rules and monitoring software installed on Emily's devices. 1 week before the murder, Melissa had confiscated Emily's smartphone for 24 hours after discovering Emily had created alternative accounts to circumvent the monitoring. The day of the murder, Melissa had discovered Emily was failing 3 classes due to truancy and had informed her daughter that phone privileges would be revoked indefinitely. According to Emily's social media posts recovered later from cloud backups, losing access to her phone felt like having my oxygen cut off and made her want to die or kill someone. The brutality of the crime scene contrasted sharply with the composed demeanor Emily displayed during her initial police interview. Detective Johnson noted in his report that Emily maintained eye contact, spoke clearly, and showed no visible signs of distress when discussing her mother's death. She claimed to have been at Amber's house since 4:30 that afternoon, studying for a biology test, and expressed appropriate shock when informed of her mother's murder. The only moment her composure faltered was when Johnson mentioned that they had recovered her smartphone from the crime scene, a device she had claimed was in her mother's possession. This inconsistency, seemingly minor at the time, would become the first thread that, when pulled, would unravel Emily's carefully constructed alibi and expose the digital trail of deception that would ultimately lead to her conviction. The Miami community responded to the murder with a mixture of horror, fascination, and introspection. Local news coverage focused initially on the tragedy of a respected doctor's life cut short, with colleagues from Miami Children's Hospital describing Melissa as dedicated, brilliant, and the kind of pediatrician who remembered every patient's name. As details emerged about the identity of the killer, the narrative shifted to examining the pressures facing contemporary teenagers and the potential dangers of technology addiction. Psychologists interviewed on local television spoke of digital dependence and electronic attachment disorders, while parent groups organized community forums on monitoring children's online activities. Few were willing to confront the more disturbing possibility that a 14-year-old girl had coldly calculated the murder of her mother not because of some pathology or external influence, but simply because her phone had been taken away. Melissa Taylor was 42 years old when her life ended on the Italian marble kitchen floor she had proudly installed during a home renovation just 1 year earlier. Friends described her as meticulous and achievement-oriented, a woman who had graduated at the top of her class from Johns Hopkins Medical School before building a respected pediatric practice in Miami that catered to some of the city's most affluent families. Her ex-husband, David Taylor, a corporate attorney now living in Seattle, spoke through tears at her funeral about Melissa's unflagging dedication to their daughter despite the challenges of raising a teenager alone. Colleagues marveled at how she balanced 60-hour work weeks with single parenthood, never missing Emily's school events despite the demands of her medical practice. The contradiction between Melissa's public image as a superwoman and her private struggles with an increasingly defiant daughter would become a central theme in understanding the tragedy that took her life. Born to Cuban-American parents who had fled to Miami in the 1960s, Melissa Rodriguez had grown up in a middle-class household where education was prized above all else. Her father worked 3 jobs to put her through private school, and Melissa had honored his sacrifices by earning scholarships that funded her journey through college and medical school. Childhood friends recalled her determination and focus, with one telling investigators that, even at 10 years old, Melissa had a 20-year plan for her life. That plan had included becoming a doctor, marrying at 30, and having exactly 1 child, goals she had accomplished with the same precision she brought to her medical diagnoses. The one deviation from her carefully plotted life had been her divorce 7 years ago, an event that colleagues said had cracked the perfect facade, but ultimately revealed Melissa's resilience as she rebuilt her life as a single mother and successful physician. Melissa's pediatric practice, Biscayne Bay Children's Health, had become one of the most sought after in Miami, with a waiting list for new patients that stretched to 6 months. Parents described her as warm but efficient, capable of making accurate diagnoses where other doctors had failed, while still making children feel at ease during examinations. "She saved my son's life by catching a heart defect other doctors had missed," one parent wrote in an online tribute that appeared after news of her murder broke. Her medical partner of 8 years, Dr. James Willis, described Melissa as brilliant clinically, but also deeply empathetic, a rare combination in medicine. He recalled how she had established a sliding-scale payment program for families without insurance, quietly subsidizing treatments for children whose parents couldn't afford care, despite the practice's location in affluent Coral Gables. The walls of Melissa's home office displayed her numerous professional accolades, her medical degree, board certifications, and awards from the Florida Medical Association for excellence in pediatric care. These symbols of professional success contrasted with the personal mementos scattered throughout the room, framed photographs of Emily at various ages, mother and daughter, smiling on beaches, at Disney World, and in the backyard pool of their Miami home. The most recent photo, taken just 6 months before the murder, showed a noticeable change. Emily's smile seemed forced, her body language stiff, as she stood apart from her mother at her 14th birthday celebration. Melissa's sister, Maria Rodriguez, told investigators that this physical and emotional distancing had been a source of tremendous pain for Melissa, who couldn't understand how her sweet little girl had become so angry, so distant, so obsessed with that damn phone. Colleagues at Miami Children's Hospital, where Melissa held admitting privileges, organized a memorial service that drew hundreds of attendees, including patients' families, medical professionals, and community members shocked by her violent death. Dr. Sophia Chen, chief of pediatrics, described Melissa as irreplaceable, a physician who combined exceptional clinical skills with genuine compassion for every child who came through her door. Former patients, now adults themselves, spoke of Dr. Taylor's influence on their career choices, with 3 having followed her into pediatric medicine. The hospital announced the establishment of the Melissa Taylor Memorial Scholarship for aspiring pediatricians from underprivileged backgrounds, honoring her commitment to expanding access to quality medical care in Miami's diverse communities. The outpouring of grief and respect demonstrated the profound impact Melissa had made on her professional community, a stark contrast to the apparent absence of value her own daughter had placed on her life. In the months before her death, Melissa had confided in a small circle of friends about her increasing concerns regarding Emily's behavior. Text messages recovered from Melissa's phone revealed late-night conversations with her sister about Emily's addiction to her smartphone, social media platforms that Melissa couldn't understand, and disturbing online relationships with people Emily had never met in person. "I don't know who she's becoming," Melissa wrote 3 weeks before her death. "She looks at me with such hatred sometimes, just because I set basic rules about screen time." Friends reported that Melissa had sought advice from adolescent psychologists and had even begun attending a support group for parents of troubled teens, determined to find a way to reconnect with her daughter. Her appointment calendar showed a scheduled consultation with a residential therapeutic program for the week after her death, a meeting Emily would have viewed as the ultimate threat to her digital lifeline. The tension between Melissa's professional success and her private struggles created a painful duality in her final months. By day, she was Dr. Taylor, the confident pediatrician trusted by Miami's elite to care for their children. By night, she was a mother increasingly afraid of her own child, sleeping with her bedroom door locked after Emily had twice been caught standing over her bed in the middle of the night. A journal found in Melissa's bedside table, entered into evidence during the trial, contained entries that revealed her growing fear. "Something is wrong with Emily," she wrote 2 months before her death. "It's more than normal teenage rebellion. The way she looks at me sometimes makes me wonder if she's capable of violence." This premonition, dismissed by friends as maternal anxiety, would prove tragically accurate. Melissa's dreams for her daughter were documented in a letter found in her desk drawer, apparently written but never given to Emily on her 14th birthday. "I see so much potential in you," the letter read. "You're brilliant and capable of anything you set your mind to. I know we're struggling right now, but I believe in you completely. Everything I do, every rule, every consequence comes from love, and my belief that you deserve a future as bright as your mind." The letter, read aloud in court by prosecutor Claire Edwards, provided a heartbreaking glimpse into Melissa's hopes for reconciliation with the daughter who would, 4 months later, end her life over a confiscated phone. The contrast between Melissa's unconditional love and Emily's calculated violence would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of the parent-child bond. The victim impact statements delivered at Emily's sentencing hearing painted a portrait of Melissa Taylor that went beyond her roles as doctor and mother. Her sister Maria spoke of Melissa's love of salsa dancing, her volunteer work teaching health classes in underserved Miami neighborhoods, and her dream of someday opening a clinic for immigrant children without access to health care. Colleagues described her mentorship of young female physicians navigating the still male-dominated medical hierarchy, while friends recalled her wry humor and loyalty. "Melissa never gave up on anyone she loved," said her closest friend, Dr. Rebecca Goldstein. "She never would have given up on Emily, no matter how difficult things became." The tragedy of Melissa Taylor's death lay not only in its violence, but in its timing, cut down in her prime by the person she had devoted her life to nurturing, just as that person was entering her own adolescence. The 911 call came in at 7:27 on the evening of March 7th, the caller identifying herself as Sophia Mendez, the Taylors' next-door neighbor. "I heard a loud bang like a gunshot from the house next door," Mendez told the dispatcher, her voice shaking. "I went over to check and knocked, but nobody answered, so I looked through the window and saw Melissa on the kitchen floor with blood everywhere." Mendez, a retired schoolteacher who had lived next to the Taylors for 8 years, told the dispatcher that she had seen Emily leaving the house shortly after hearing the noise, backpack in hand, walking quickly toward the bus stop. The recording captured Mendez's growing distress as she realized the implications of what she had witnessed. "Oh my God, do you think Emily did this? She's just a child." First responders arrived 6 minutes after the call, breaking through the locked front door to find Melissa Taylor dead from a single gunshot wound to the head, her body already showing signs of lividity indicating she had been dead for at least 30 minutes. Detective Marcus Johnson arrived at the scene at 8:45 after uniformed officers had secured the perimeter and confirmed there were no other victims in the house. Johnson, known in the department for his methodical approach to crime scenes, began by walking the exterior of the property, noting the broken patio door glass, the intact security system, and the lack of disturbance to the meticulously maintained tropical landscaping that surrounded the Spanish-style home. Inside, Johnson observed what appeared to be a staged burglary scene. Drawers pulled out in the living room, couch cushions displaced, and a jewelry box overturned on Melissa's bedroom dresser. The detective's first impression, recorded in his initial notes, was that the scene lacks the chaotic energy of a real break-in. Items are disturbed but not damaged, valuables are visible but untaken, and the disturbance is superficial rather than destructive. His 30 years of experience in Miami-Dade law enforcement, with its cycles of home invasions and property crimes, told him immediately that something about this scene didn't match the patterns of actual burglaries. The victim lay in a pool of congealed blood on the kitchen floor, a single gunshot wound visible above her right temple, with exit wound damage to the left side of her skull. Melissa Taylor was dressed in surgical scrubs, suggesting she had recently returned from work, and a half-eaten salad sat on the kitchen island alongside a glass of wine and an open laptop displaying her medical practices scheduling software. Crime scene technicians photographed a smartphone on the floor near the body, later confirmed to be Emily's device, which would become crucial evidence in the case. The position of the body, the blood spatter patterns on the white cabinets, and the trajectory of the bullet recovered from the kitchen wall all indicated that Melissa had been seated on a bar stool at the island when she was shot from behind at close range. Medical examiner Dr. Amelia Wong, who arrived at 9:30 to pronounce death officially and supervise the removal of the body, estimated time of death at between 6:45 and 7:15, based on body temperature, lividity, and rigor mortis progression. The foundational clue that would ultimately solve the case was discovered almost immediately, though its significance wouldn't be fully understood until days later. Crime scene technician Javier Rodriguez was photographing and bagging the smartphone found near Melissa's body when he noticed something unusual. The phone's GPS location service was active, showing the device at an address across town, the home of Emily's friend Amber Collins. "I've seen this before," Rodriguez told Detective Johnson. "There are apps that let you spoof your GPS location, make it look like you're somewhere you're not." This digital anomaly, this intentional manipulation of location data, would become the thread that, when pulled, would unravel Emily's carefully constructed alibi and reveal a disturbing pattern of premeditation. The GPS tracking evidence, a digital trail of deception, would ultimately prove more damning than fingerprints or DNA in establishing both Emily's presence at the scene and her premeditated intent to commit murder and evade detection. While the crime scene investigation progressed at the Taylor home, Detective Sarah Rivera was dispatched to the Collins residence where Emily had gone after allegedly leaving the scene. Rivera found Emily and Amber sitting in the Collins family room, ostensibly working on a school project, with Emily showing no visible signs of distress. When informed that something had happened at her home and that she needed to come to the station with her friend's parents, Emily asked calmly, "Is it about my mom? Is she okay?" Rivera, trained in detecting deception, noted in her report that Emily's concern seemed performative rather than genuine, the questions asked with flat affect and no physiological signs of actual anxiety. A search of Emily's backpack, conducted with the consent of Amber's parents as Emily was a minor in their care, revealed the murder weapon wrapped in a sweater, along with a second smartphone, an older model that Emily claimed was a backup device. Back at the Taylor residence, The initial canvass of the neighborhood revealed that no one had seen any unfamiliar vehicles or individuals in the area during the time frame of the murder. Sofia Mendez's statement about seeing Emily leave was corroborated by security camera footage from a home across the street, which captured Emily walking away from the direction of her house at approximately 7:13, wearing dark clothing and carrying a backpack. Another neighbor, retired Detective Frank Morales, reported hearing what he believed was a gunshot somewhere between 7 and 7:15, but had dismissed it as a car backfiring or a transformer blowing. Not uncommon sounds in the Miami suburb during the rainy season. The lack of evidence supporting a break-in, combined with Emily being the last person seen leaving the residence and her possession of the murder weapon, made her an immediate person of interest, despite her age. The processing of the crime scene continued through the night, with technicians collecting fingerprints, DNA samples, and trace evidence throughout the house. Emily's bedroom became a focus of the investigation, with technicians recovering a laptop computer, a tablet, and various journals and school notebooks. The desk drawer contained printouts of articles on topics including how to make murder look like robbery, can police track fake GPS locations, and what happens to minors who commit murder in Florida. A search of the browsing history on Emily's laptop revealed extensive research on these topics, along with searches for how to unlock gun safe, shooting someone in the head, and can teenagers get the death penalty. Most damning was the discovery of a location spoofing application installed on both Emily's laptop and the smartphone found at the crime scene, configured to make it appear that the phone was at Amber's house during the time of the murder, a sophisticated attempt at creating a digital alibi that ultimately became evidence of premeditation. As dawn broke over Miami on March 8th, Emily Taylor sat in an interview room at the Miami-Dade Police Department's Homicide Division, her friend's parents having been replaced by a court-appointed attorney and a representative from the Department of Children and Families. Detective Johnson, joined by his partner, Detective Rivera, began the formal interview process with the standard juvenile Miranda warnings, explaining that Emily was not under arrest but was being questioned in connection with her mother's death. Emily maintained her composure throughout the initial questioning, claiming she had left home at 4:30 to study with Amber and had not returned. When asked about the smartphone found next to her mother's body, Emily claimed it must have been left at home accidentally when she left for Amber's house. The first cracks in her facade appeared when Johnson revealed that the phone had been actively manipulated to show a false location during the time of the murder, technology beyond what a typical break-in robber would employ. The breakthrough in the initial investigation came not from Emily's interrogation, but from the digital forensics team's preliminary examination of the devices recovered from the scene. Tech specialist Aidan Park discovered that Emily's smartphone had been connected to her laptop just 1 hour before the estimated time of death, and the location spoofing app had been activated at that time. Furthermore, text messages recovered from the phone's memory showed a conversation between Emily and Amber coordinating their alibi, messages that had been deleted but remained in the phone's backup files. "I'll text you when it's done," Emily had written at 5:28 that evening. "Remember, I've been at your house since 4:30. Amber's reply, "Are you sure you want to do this? You can't take it back." Emily's final message in the exchange, sent at 6:15. "She deserves it for trying to control me. Nobody takes my phone away." The foundational clue, the GPS tracking evidence, expanded beyond the initial discovery of the location spoofing application as the investigation progressed. Digital forensics revealed that while Emily had attempted to create a false digital alibi by manipulating her phone's GPS data, she had failed to account for multiple other digital footprints that placed her at the murder scene. The family's Wi-Fi network had connection logs showing Emily's devices accessing the internet from within the home until 7:12, minutes before she was captured on video leaving the neighborhood. Google's location history, linked to Emily's account and more difficult to spoof than simple GPS data, showed her movement from the house to the bus stop to Amber's residence. Most damning was the health application on Emily's phone, which had recorded her step count, heart rate, and elevation changes, showing a spike in heart rate at the approximate time of the murder, and tracking her movement throughout the house in the minutes before and after. By the afternoon of March 8th, just 18 hours after Melissa Taylor's body was discovered, Detective Johnson had secured a judicial order to take Emily into custody as a juvenile offender suspected of first-degree murder. The GPS tracking evidence, combined with her possession of the murder weapon, the research into methods of killing and evading detection, and the coordinated alibi with Amber Collins, created a compelling case for premeditation. As Emily was escorted from the interview room to a juvenile detention transport vehicle, reporters gathered outside the police station captured images of the 14-year-old that would shock the nation. A slight figure in a Miami Dolphins sweatshirt, face expressionless, showing no visible reaction to the cameras or shouted questions about whether she had killed her mother. These images, juxtaposed with school photographs of Emily smiling in a private school uniform and pictures of Melissa in her doctor's coat, would become iconic representations of a case that would challenge conventional understandings of adolescent capacity for violence and the potential dangers of digital dependency. The Digital Forensics Lab at Miami-Dade Police Department became the epicenter of the investigation, as technicians began the painstaking process of extracting and analyzing data from Emily's devices. Lead analyst Aidan Park, a former FBI cybercrime specialist, recognized immediately that this case would hinge on electronic evidence rather than traditional forensics. The first red flag was the location discrepancy, Park later testified. Emily's phone showed she was at her friend's house during the murder, but the phone itself was found at the crime scene next to her mother's body. This contradiction led Park to dig deeper into the device's location history, uncovering a sophisticated attempt to create a false digital alibi through what he termed location spoofing, using specialized applications to make a device report being somewhere it physically wasn't. The GPS tracking data had been manipulated, but like most digital deception, it left traces that an expert could detect and reconstruct, creating a damning timeline of Emily's actual movements. Detective Marcus Johnson assembled a comprehensive timeline by integrating digital evidence with traditional investigative methods. Cell tower data placed Emily's secondary phone, the backup found in her backpack, moving from her school to her home at 3:45, contradicting her claim of going directly to Amber's house. Security footage from a gas station 2 blocks from the Taylor residence captured Emily purchasing a pair of latex gloves at 4:23, wearing the same clothes she would later be seen in leaving the neighborhood after the murder. The family's smart home system, which logged entry and exit through electronically controlled doors, recorded Emily entering the house at 4:30 and no further entry until first responders arrived, disproving any possibility of an outside intruder. Most significantly, Emily's internet search history revealed a 3-month progression of increasingly specific inquiries, from how to deal with controlling parents, to what happens if you kill your mother, to how to stage a crime scene, to best place to shoot someone for instant death. The GPS tracking evidence expanded as Park discovered Emily had installed the location spoofing application on her devices 3 weeks before the murder, around the same time Melissa had first confiscated her phone as punishment. A review of Emily's journal recovered from her bedroom contained an entry from that period. "She thinks taking my phone gives her power over me. She has no idea what I'm capable of." Subsequent entries documented Emily's growing resentment, with increasingly violent fantasies about making her pay and teaching her a final lesson. The premeditated nature of the crime became evident as investigators uncovered Emily's digital preparations, creating fake social media posts scheduled to appear during the time of the murder, researching police investigation techniques for homicides, and studying juvenile sentencing guidelines in Florida. Detective Johnson, presenting these findings to prosecutor Claire Edwards, characterized Emily as methodical in her planning, but careless in her assumptions about digital evidence. She didn't understand that manipulating GPS data would itself become evidence of intent. Interviews with Emily's teachers and classmates revealed a pattern of concerning behavior that had escalated in the months leading up to the murder. Emily's English teacher, Margaret Chen, provided copies of increasingly disturbing creative writing assignments, including a short story entitled Perfect Crime that described a daughter killing her mother and framing a burglar, written 2 months before Melissa's murder. School counselor Robert Patel reported 3 meetings with Emily regarding angry outbursts in class, all triggered by teachers confiscating her phone, according to school policy. Emily's former friends described her withdrawal from social activities in favor of online relationships, with one stating that Emily acted like her phone was part of her body. She had panic attacks if she couldn't check it every few minutes. This dependency had intensified after her parents' divorce, with the smartphone becoming both Emily's primary connection to a world beyond her mother's control and the source of increasing conflict between them. Amber Collins, initially steadfast in supporting Emily's alibi, broke down during her second interview with Detective Sarah Rivera. Tearfully, she admitted that Emily had arrived at her house shortly after 7:30, not 4:30 as they had claimed, and had made Amber promise to lie about the timeline. She came in all weird and quiet and immediately took a shower, Amber told investigators. She made me promise to say she'd been with me since after school, but she wouldn't tell me why it was important. When news reports about Melissa's murder began appearing on social media later that evening, Amber confronted Emily, who admitted what she had done but showed no remorse. She just said her mom deserved it for trying to control her life, and that without a phone, she might as well be dead anyway. Amber's testimony, combined with the recovery of text messages between the girls planning the false alibi, established Emily not only as the prime suspect but as someone who had enlisted others in her attempt to evade justice. The forensic examination of the murder weapon yielded further evidence connecting Emily to the crime. The 9mm Glock handgun, registered to David Taylor, Emily's father, had been kept in a biometric safe in Melissa's bedroom closet. While the safe was designed to open only with Melissa's fingerprint, investigators discovered that Emily had researched methods to bypass biometric locks and had used a silicone putty to create a cast of her mother's fingerprint while Melissa slept, a technique she had learned from a YouTube tutorial on phone hacking. Emily's search history included queries like how to make a fingerprint mold and bypassing fingerprint locks, indicating weeks of planning. The recovered cast, found hidden in a hollowed-out book in Emily's room, matched Melissa's fingerprint exactly and showed traces of the same metallic powder found on the safe's scanner, physical evidence that complemented the digital trail and further demonstrated the calculated nature of Emily's actions. As the investigation progressed, Emily's digital footprint revealed a disturbing online life hidden from her mother. Using anonymous accounts on platforms Melissa didn't monitor, Emily had joined forums dedicated to discussing parental abuse, revenge fantasies, and methods of committing untraceable crimes. In one private chat recovered through a forensic examination of her laptop, Emily had written, "My mom thinks taking away my phone is just a punishment, but it's like cutting off my oxygen. I'd rather be dead than disconnected. Maybe she should be the dead one instead." This message, sent just 10 days before the murder, was followed by exchanges with an unidentified user who provided links to websites describing how to stage crime scenes and the limitations of forensic investigations. The GPS tracking data showed Emily had visited these websites repeatedly, often late at night when her mother was asleep, compiling information that she believed would help her commit the perfect crime and establish an unbreakable alibi. The evidence against Emily Taylor mounted as the investigation continued, with each new discovery reinforcing the image of a calculating killer rather than an impulsive teenager. The GPS tracking evidence, her attempt to create a false digital alibi, became the central thread that connected all other elements of the case, demonstrating both her presence at the scene and her premeditated intent to kill and evade detection. 4 days after Melissa Taylor's murder, prosecutor Claire Edwards made the decision to charge Emily as an adult rather than a juvenile, citing the heinous nature of the crime, the extensive evidence of premeditation, and the sophisticated attempts to evade justice. This decision, controversial given Emily's age, would set the stage for one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Florida's recent history, and spark a national debate about juvenile justice, digital evidence, and the profound disconnection between a generation raised on constant connectivity and the parents trying to set boundaries in an increasingly digital world. By the end of the first week of investigation, Emily Taylor had emerged not just as a suspect, but as the only possible perpetrator of her mother's murder. The GPS tracking evidence that began as a curious digital anomaly, a smartphone reporting its location miles from where it physically existed, had expanded into a comprehensive digital trail that mapped not only Emily's movements on the day of the murder, but her psychological journey toward violence over the preceding months. Detective Johnson, presenting the case to the grand jury that would ultimately indict Emily for first-degree murder, characterized the evidence as a perfect digital fingerprint, more comprehensive and damning than any physical evidence could be. The 14-year-old girl who had researched how to commit the perfect murder had ironically created the perfect evidence against herself, leaving a digital trail of deception that would lead directly to an unprecedented sentence for a juvenile offender in the state of Florida. Prosecutor Claire Edwards sat at her desk in the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office, surrounded by stacks of evidence reports and digital forensic analyses that would form the foundation of her case against Emily Taylor. A veteran prosecutor with 15 years of experience handling homicide cases, Edwards had never before prosecuted a defendant so young for a crime so calculated. The GPS tracking evidence, what she was now calling the digital trail of deception, formed the central pillar of her strategy, providing irrefutable proof of both Emily's presence at the crime scene and her premeditated intent to kill her mother and evade justice. Edwards worked closely with digital forensics expert Aidan Park to translate the complex technical evidence into a clear narrative that would be comprehensible to a jury potentially unfamiliar with concepts like location spoofing, GPS metadata, and digital footprints. Together, they constructed a timeline that integrated the digital evidence with traditional forensic findings, creating what Edwards called a perfect circle of guilt around Emily Taylor. The case expanded beyond the initial discovery of the location spoofing application, as investigators conducted a deep analysis of all of Emily's digital activities. Google location data, which used multiple inputs beyond simple GPS to track a user's movements, showed Emily's phone physically moving from her high school to her home on the afternoon of the murder, then to the bus stop, and finally to Amber Collins's house, directly contradicting the false location data created by the spoofing app. Emily's laptop contained a browser history of YouTube tutorials on how to make it look like your phone is somewhere else, and fooling parents with fake GPS, viewed repeatedly in the weeks before the murder. Most damning was the recovery of a deleted document titled The Plan, which outlined a step-by-step strategy for killing Melissa and establishing an alibi, including specific instructions to start the GPS spoofer at 4:30, making it look like I'm at Amber's, and make sure to text Mom from the spoofed location asking about dinner to establish digital proof I'm not home. The traditional forensic evidence complemented the digital trail, with crime scene technicians recovering Emily's fingerprints and DNA throughout the staged break-in scene. Residue from the gunshot was found on the sleeve of a sweatshirt hidden in Emily's closet, despite her having showered at Amber's house immediately after the murder. The murder weapon, wiped clean of prints but containing traces of Emily's DNA on the grip, was matched conclusively to the bullet recovered from Melissa's skull. Blood spatter analysis indicated that the shooter had stood directly behind Melissa as she sat at the kitchen island, suggesting a position of trust rather than confrontation. The victim had no defensive wounds and showed no signs of having anticipated the attack. Medical examiner Dr. Amelia Wong concluded that the angle and proximity of the gunshot indicated that Melissa had been shot by someone she wasn't perceiving as a threat, someone she had no reason to fear would harm her. The methodical building of the case continued with the establishment of motive, drawing heavily on recovered text messages, journal entries, and social media posts that documented Emily's escalating resentment of her mother's authority. Assistant Prosecutor James Chen created a detailed timeline of the relationship breakdown, beginning with Melissa's discovery of inappropriate online communications 3 months prior to her death and tracking the increasingly severe restrictions on Emily's phone usage that followed. "The pattern is clear," Chen wrote in his case notes. "Each time Dr. Taylor implemented a new restriction on Emily's digital access, Emily's private expressions of hatred and revenge fantasies intensified. The final catalyst, Melissa's decision to confiscate Emily's phone indefinitely after discovering her academic failures, had occurred just hours before the murder, providing both immediate motive and explaining the timing of Emily's decision to act on her long-considered plan. Aidan Park's forensic analysis of Emily's online activities revealed what he termed digital rehearsal for the murder, including extensive research on gun mechanisms, human anatomy focusing on fatal head wounds, and methods of staging crime scenes to mislead investigators. Emily had created a private Instagram account using a prepaid credit card purchased with cash, where she followed forensic science experts and true crime discussion groups, absorbing information about how homicides were investigated and the mistakes that typically led to killers being caught. Her search history included queries like, "Do juvenile killers get tried as adults?" "Average sentence for teenage murderers?" and countries without extradition treaties with U.S., suggesting she had considered not just the crime itself, but its potential consequences and possible escape plans. This extensive digital preparation, meticulously documented by Park's team, transformed what might have been portrayed as an impulsive teenage outburst into evidence of calculated, premeditated murder. The relationship between Emily and Amber Collins became a focus of the investigation, with Edwards building a case that Amber had been manipulated into becoming an unwitting accomplice. Text messages recovered from both girls' phones showed Emily gradually testing Amber's loyalty with increasingly serious requests to lie on her behalf, beginning with covering for minor infractions like skipping school and escalating to the murder alibi. In one exchange 3 weeks before the murder, Emily had asked, "If I needed you to swear I was with you when I wasn't, would you do it no matter what, even if cops asked you?" When Amber had expressed reservations, Emily responded, "That's why I need to know who my real friends are." This psychological manipulation, combined with Amber's eventual decision to tell the truth to investigators, would become a powerful narrative tool for the prosecution, demonstrating Emily's calculated exploitation of relationships and her willingness to implicate others to protect herself. The GPS tracking evidence expanded further as investigators discovered Emily had conducted a dry run of her plan 1 week before the murder, using the location spoofing app to make it appear she was at the local library while actually visiting a pawn shop to inquire about purchasing an untraceable handgun. Unaware that the shop's security cameras would capture her presence, Emily had created a digital alibi that she believed would be perfect. Her phone's location data showed her at the library, while library records confirmed she had logged into the public Wi-Fi using her student credentials. This practice attempt at digital deception, combined with her journal entry that same evening describing it as a successful test, provided powerful evidence that the location spoofing on the day of the murder was not a coincidence or an innocent use of technology, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan to create a false alibi for a premeditated killing. As the prosecution team built their case, they also prepared for the anticipated defense strategies. Emily's court-appointed attorney, veteran public defender Michael Rodriguez, had indicated in preliminary hearings that he would pursue a strategy combining diminished capacity due to Emily's age with claims of undiagnosed mental illness and technology addiction. Edwards and her team worked with psychiatrist Dr. Eleanor Patel to examine Emily and assess these potential defenses, with Dr. Patel ultimately concluding that Emily showed no signs of psychosis or dissociative disorders that would prevent her from understanding the nature or consequences of her actions. Furthermore, Dr. Patel found that rather than technology addiction diminishing Emily's capacity, her extensive use of technology had actually enhanced her ability to plan and execute the crime, providing her with resources, information, and tools that previous generations of adolescents would not have had access to. The final element of the prosecution's case centered on establishing the timeline of March 7th in minute detail, integrating digital evidence from multiple sources to create what Edwards called a perfect record of premeditated murder. Emily's school's electronic attendance system recorded her leaving campus at 3:15 after her last class. Transit card records showed her boarding a bus at 3:22 and disembarking near her home at 3:41. The family's smart home system logged her entering the house at 3:45. Emily's browser history showed her accessing the location spoofing application at 4:20, setting it to make her phone appear to be at Amber's house. At 4:23, she was captured on gas station security footage purchasing latex gloves. At 4:45, Emily sent a text to her mother from her spoofed location, asking what was for dinner, a message designed to establish her digital presence elsewhere. Melissa, unaware of the deception, replied at 5:30 after finishing her clinic hours, indicating she'd be home by 6 and they needed to have a serious talk about your grades. The digital record continued, showing Emily researching silencers for Glock handguns at 5:45, accessing her father's gun safe using the silicone fingerprint cast at 6:10, and activating the home security system's vacation mode at 6:15, a setting that disabled the internal motion sensors while maintaining perimeter alerts. Melissa's keycard access at her medical practice showed her leaving work at 5:45, and traffic cameras tracked her vehicle arriving in their neighborhood at 6:05. The home security system logged her entry at 6:12. Between 6:15 and 7:10, no digital activity was recorded from either Emily or Melissa's devices, the window during which the murder occurred. At 7:11, Emily reactivated her phone, broke the patio door glass from inside the house, and exited the property, being captured on a neighbor's security camera, walking away at 7:13. Bus transit records showed her boarding a city bus at 7:22 and arriving near Amber's house at 7:41. all while her phone's spoofed GPS data showed it had been at Amber's house continuously since 4:30. This comprehensive digital timeline, supported by physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, created what Prosecutor Edwards described to her team as an airtight case of premeditated murder committed by a defendant who understood exactly what she was doing, took extensive steps to avoid detection, and showed complete indifference to the value of her mother's life. The GPS tracking evidence, the digital trail of deception, had evolved from a single anomalous data point into a complex web of digital breadcrumbs that mapped not just Emily's movements, but her thought processes, her preparations, and her attempts to create a perfect alibi. As Edwards prepared to present this case to the court, she knew that the technological nature of both the evidence and the motive would make this a landmark case in the evolving intersection of digital forensics and criminal justice, potentially setting precedents for how the legal system would address similar cases in an increasingly digitized world. The Juvenile Detention Center in Miami's Justice Complex was designed with muted colors and rounded corners to soften its institutional nature. But there was no disguising its purpose as Emily Taylor was led through security checkpoints toward the interview room. 4 days after her mother's murder, having been held in protective custody while the investigation progressed, Emily was about to face formal arrest and charging as an adult, a decision that had generated intense debate among prosecutors, child advocates, and legal experts across Florida. Detective Marcus Johnson and his partner, Detective Sarah Rivera, waited in the sparsely furnished room, case files spread across the metal table, a digital recorder ready to capture what would become a pivotal moment in the case. Emily entered with her court-appointed attorney, Michael Rodriguez, her slight frame swimming in the standard-issue orange jumpsuit, her face showing none of the fear or distress expected from a 14-year-old in such circumstances. Johnson, a father himself, with a daughter only a year younger than Emily, found her composure more disturbing than any display of emotion would have been. "Emily, do you understand why you're here today?" Johnson began after Rodriguez nodded permission for the interview to proceed. The teenager nodded, maintaining direct eye contact with the detective in a manner that experienced interrogators recognized as uncommon for her, both her age and her situation. Rodriguez had advised Emily of her rights and the gravity of her situation, explaining that the district attorney had decided to charge her as an adult for first-degree murder, potentially carrying a life sentence despite her age. "I understand," Emily replied, her voice steady. "You think I killed my mother." The use of "you think" rather than a denial caught Johnson's attention, a subtle linguistic distancing that experienced investigators recognized as common among guilty parties attempting to separate themselves from responsibility. Rodriguez placed a hand on Emily's arm, a silent reminder of their pre-interview discussion about limited responses, but the gesture came too late to prevent what Johnson noted as the first crack in Emily's carefully constructed facade. The interrogation strategy had been meticulously planned, with Johnson beginning with open-ended questions about Emily's relationship with her mother before gradually introducing elements of the evidence against her. Emily described Melissa as controlling and obsessed with micromanaging my life, focusing particularly on what she characterized as irrational restrictions on her phone and internet access. When asked about the events of March 7th, Emily maintained her original story. She had left school, gone directly to Amber's house to study, and remained there until police contacted her. Johnson listened without interruption, noting how Emily's account remained consistent with her initial statement, a prepared narrative delivered without the natural inconsistencies typically present in truthful recollections. When she finished, he nodded thoughtfully before sliding a folder across the table. "Emily, I'd like to discuss some discrepancies between your account and the evidence we've gathered," he said, watching her face carefully for reaction. The folder contained printouts of the GPS data from Emily's smartphone, showing two parallel timelines. The fake location history created by the spoofing application, placing the phone at Amber's house from 4:30 onward, and the actual movement data recovered from Google's location services, cell tower connections, and the phone's health application, tracking the device from school to Emily's home to the bus stop to Amber's. Johnson explained each element methodically, using simplified language to ensure Emily understood the technical aspects of the evidence. "This is what we call the digital trail of deception," he explained, pointing to the contradictory location data. "Your phone was physically at the crime scene, next to your mother's body, yet was programmed to show it was miles away at your friend's house." Emily's expression remained neutral as Johnson continued, "The only person who could have set up this elaborate deception was someone who had access to both the phone and specialized knowledge of location spoofing technology, someone who wanted to create a false alibi for themselves." As the interview progressed, Johnson introduced additional elements of the digital evidence. Emily's extensive online research into methods of killing, staging crime scenes, and evading detection. The text messages coordinating the false alibi with Amber. The document titled The Plan, recovered from her laptop, and the practice run of the location spoofing technology 1 week before the murder. With each new piece of evidence, Emily's attorney grew visibly more concerned, while Emily herself maintained a composed exterior that only occasionally betrayed flickers of surprise. Not at the accusations, Johnson noted, but at the extent and specificity of the evidence against her. The detective recognized this reaction from previous interrogations of adults who believed they had committed perfect crimes, only to discover that technology had created evidence they hadn't anticipated. "Emily," Johnson said gently, "technology leaves traces we couldn't have imagined even 10 years ago. Everything you did online, every app you used, every location you visited, it all created a digital record that tells us exactly what happened." The turning point in the interrogation came when Johnson produced a printout of Emily's Google search history from the weeks preceding the murder, highlighting queries such as, "Can teenagers get the death penalty in Florida?" "Countries with no extradition to U.S., and "How long before a missing person is declared dead?" Emily's composure faltered visibly for the first time, her eyes widening slightly before she regained control. "These searches," Johnson continued, "combined with the location spoofing application and your documented interest in staging crime scenes, show something very specific: premeditation. They show that you not only thought about killing your mother, but actively planned it, researched it, and took concrete steps to avoid getting caught." Emily glanced at her attorney, who leaned in to whisper something, but she shook her head slightly and returned her attention to the detective. "Those searches don't prove anything," she said finally. "Lots of teenagers look up weird stuff online. It doesn't mean I actually did anything." Detective Rivera, who had remained silent during the initial phase of the interrogation, now opened another folder containing photographs of the crime scene, carefully selecting images that showed the technical aspects of the investigation without including graphic depictions of Melissa's body. "Emily, we found your fingerprints on the gun safe, on the handle of the patio door that was broken from the inside, and on these drawers that were pulled out to make it look like a burglary," she explained, pointing to specific images. "We found gunshot residue on a sweatshirt hidden in your closet. We have security footage of you purchasing latex gloves shortly before the murder. We have Amber's statement confirming you arrived at her house after 7:30, not 4:30 as you claimed." Rivera paused, allowing the weight of the evidence to settle before adding, "Most importantly, we have the GPS tracking evidence, your digital trail of deception, that shows exactly how you plan to create a false alibi by making it appear your phone was somewhere it wasn't." For several moments, silence filled the interview room as Emily stared at the photographs spread before her. Johnson and Rivera exchanged a glance recognizing the critical juncture in the interrogation. the moment when a suspect typically either continues to deny despite overwhelming evidence or begins to offer justifications that amount to admissions of guilt. Emily looked up finally, her eyes moving between the two detectives before settling on Johnson. "She was going to send me away," she said, her voice suddenly smaller, younger. "I found the brochure for that boarding school for troubled teens in her desk. She was going to lock me up somewhere without my phone, without internet, without any connection to the real world." This first acknowledgement, not quite a confession but a clear step away from denial, was accompanied by the first display of emotion. Not remorse for her mother's death, but fear of the isolation she had believed awaited her. "Tell us what happened, Emily," Johnson prompted gently, recognizing the opening. "Help us understand." Rodriguez interjected, advising Emily that she didn't have to continue, but Emily shook her head. "It doesn't matter," she said to her attorney, a flatness entering her voice. "They already know everything anyway." Turning back to the detectives, she began to speak in a detached, almost clinical tone that Johnson would later describe in his report as chilling in its emotional disconnection. She described discovering the brochure for the therapeutic boarding school 3 weeks earlier, her growing fear that her mother planned to lock her away, and her decision that removing the threat was the only logical solution. She detailed how she had researched methods of killing, created the silicone cast of her mother's fingerprint, and practiced using the location spoofing application to create a false alibi. "The plan worked exactly as I designed it," she said with a hint of pride that visibly disturbed even her attorney. "The only thing I didn't account for was how much digital evidence would be created by my research and our preparation." As the confession continued, Emily described waiting for her mother to return home on March 7th, sitting at the kitchen island with her laptop while Melissa ate a salad and reviewed patient files. "She started talking about my grades again, about how I was throwing away my future, about how she was going to take more drastic measures," Emily recounted. "She said my phone was destroying my life and she was going to make sure I couldn't access it or any other technology until I remembered my priorities. That's when I went upstairs, used the fingerprint cast to open the gun safe, and came back down." The clinical detachment with which Emily described shooting her mother, "I approached from behind to ensure she wouldn't see it coming and aimed for the head for instantaneous death," sent a chill through the interview room. Even Rivera, a veteran of hundreds of homicide investigations, found herself disturbed by the teenager's affect, which reminded her more of a student describing a science project than a daughter recounting her mother's murder. The most revealing moment came when Johnson asked about Emily's feelings in the aftermath of killing her mother. Instead of expressing remorse, grief, or even the relief that often follows acts of revenge, Emily focused entirely on the technical aspects of her actions. "After confirming she was dead, I implemented the staged break-in according to my research, being careful to create sufficient disorder without actual damage to valuable items, which would have been inconsistent with typical burglary patterns," she explained. "I then activated the location spoofing application to ensure digital records would show my phone had been at Amber's house continuously, broke the patio door glass from the inside to suggest an entry point, and departed according to my predetermined route to avoid neighborhood security cameras." Only when Johnson specifically asked if she felt any sadness about her mother's death did Emily pause, appearing to consider the question as if it were an unexpected variable in an equation. "I recognize that social norms would expect me to feel remorse," she said finally, "but the primary emotion I experienced was frustration that she had forced such an extreme solution by threatening to cut me off from my online life." As the 3-hour interrogation concluded, Emily Taylor had provided a full confession, detailing her motives, preparations, and execution of her mother's murder with a clarity and precision that belied her 14 years. The GPS tracking evidence, the digital trail of deception that had begun as a curious anomaly on her smartphone, had become the central thread that unraveled her carefully constructed plan and ultimately led to her confession. Detective Johnson, completing the formal arrest process as Emily was led back to her cell, felt none of the satisfaction that typically accompanied solving a complex case. Instead, he was troubled by the profound disconnect he had witnessed, not just between Emily and normal emotional responses, but between her value system and the most fundamental human bonds. In his 23 years of law enforcement, he had never before encountered a juvenile offender who had calculated the murder of a parent with such precision and who, when confronted with incontrovertible evidence, showed pride in her methodology rather than regret for her actions. The arrest report filed that evening with the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office recommended charging Emily Taylor as an adult with first-degree murder, citing the extensive evidence of premeditation, sophisticated attempts to evade justice, and complete absence of mitigating factors or remorse. Prosecutor Claire Edwards, reviewing the interrogation transcript and video recording, made the decision to seek the maximum possible penalty despite Emily's age. The GPS tracking evidence and subsequent confession reveal a defendant who, regardless of chronological age, demonstrated adult-level planning, awareness of consequences, and moral disengagement, Edwards wrote in her charging recommendation. The digital trail of deception she created to avoid responsibility for killing her mother shows a level of calculation that merits the most serious charges and penalties available under Florida law. With this decision, Emily Taylor would become one of the youngest defendants in state history to face a potential life sentence. A 14-year-old girl who had ended her mother's life over a confiscated phone and who, even in confession, showed more concern for her interrupted digital connectivity than for the parent she had murdered. The Miami-Dade County Courthouse stood as a testament to justice and order, its neoclassical facade gleaming in the harsh Florida sunlight as media trucks lined the surrounding streets on the morning of June 12th, 3 months after Melissa Taylor's murder. Inside Courtroom 3A, specially selected for high-profile cases due to its expanded seating capacity, Circuit Judge Richard Hernandez prepared to preside over what local media had already dubbed the digital deception trial. Security was unusually tight, with additional deputies positioned throughout the building in response to both the intense public interest and concerns about Emily Taylor's safety. The 14-year-old defendant had received multiple death threats since details of her mother's murder and her apparent lack of remorse had become public. As the gallery filled with journalists, legal observers, and a carefully screened public contingent, the atmosphere carried the tension of cases that transcend ordinary crime to become cultural inflection points, moments when society confronts disturbing questions about its evolution, its values, and the unforeseen consequences of technological advancement. Emily Taylor entered the courtroom flanked by her defense team, led by private attorney Sharon Mitchell, who had taken over her representation after a coalition of children's rights organizations raised funds for her defense. Gone was the detached, almost clinical demeanor Emily had displayed during her interrogation, replaced by a carefully crafted image of adolescent vulnerability. Her hair in a simple ponytail, wearing a conservative navy blue dress that emphasized her youth, eyes downcast as she walked to the defense table. Mitchell, a renowned juvenile defense attorney known for her passionate advocacy against trying children as adults, had clearly prepared her client for this public appearance, understanding that the jury's first impression would be crucial in a case where the evidence was overwhelmingly damning. The transformation was striking to Detective Marcus Johnson, seated at the prosecution table, who leaned over to whisper to Prosecutor Claire Edwards, "That's not the same girl we interviewed. This is a performance." Edwards nodded slightly, making a note to address this apparent strategy in her opening statement. Judge Hernandez called the court to order, his stern demeanor reflecting the gravity of the proceedings as he addressed the jury pool of 150 Miami-Dade County residents who would be winnowed down to 12 jurors and 4 alternates through the voir dire process. The defendant in this case is chronologically a child, he explained, but stands charged as an adult with first-degree murder, a capital offense in the state of Florida. While her age removes the possibility of the death penalty, she faces a potential sentence of life without possibility of parole if convicted. The judge emphasized the importance of setting aside preconceived notions about both juvenile offenders and the role of technology in modern life, asking potential jurors to focus solely on the evidence presented. The jury selection process would ultimately take 3 days, with defense and prosecution attorneys scrutinizing candidates' attitudes toward juvenile justice, technology use, and parental authority, factors that would inevitably color their perception of the case. On the trial's 4th day, with a jury of 8 women and 4 men finally impaneled, Claire Edwards rose to deliver the prosecution's opening statement, her tailored charcoal suit and minimal jewelry projecting professional gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "this case is about premeditated murder, the most serious crime recognized by our legal system. The evidence will show that the defendant, Emily Taylor, deliberately and methodically planned and executed the killing of her mother, Dr. Melissa Taylor, not in a moment of passion or under the influence of mental illness, but as a calculated response to having her smartphone confiscated." Edwards moved away from the podium, approaching the jury box to establish a more intimate connection as she continued. "You may find it difficult to believe that a 14-year-old could commit such a heinous act over something as seemingly trivial as a cell phone. The evidence, however, will demonstrate that for Emily Taylor, digital connection wasn't trivial. It was everything, worth more than her mother's life." Edwards then introduced what would become the central theme of the prosecution's case, the GPS tracking evidence she described as a digital trail of deception. Using a large display screen visible to the jury, Edwards showed side-by-side timelines of Emily's actual movements on March 7th, reconstructed from multiple digital sources, alongside the false location data created by her use of spoofing technology. Emily Taylor didn't just kill her mother, Edwards explained, pointing to specific discrepancies in the data. She created an elaborate digital alibi designed to make it appear she was miles away at the time of the murder. This wasn't an impulsive act, but a premeditated execution requiring technical knowledge, careful planning, and cold-blooded implementation. The prosecutor methodically outlined how the GPS evidence would connect to other elements of the case. Emily's internet search history showing research into murder methods and evidence concealment, the practice run of location spoofing conducted a week before the murder, and the text messages coordinating a false alibi with her friend Amber Collins. Edwards concluded her opening statement by directly addressing the defense strategy she anticipated. "You will likely hear arguments that Emily Taylor was too young to fully understand the consequences of her actions, that she was addicted to technology, or that she suffered from undiagnosed mental health issues. The evidence, however, will show something very different. A defendant who understood exactly what she was doing, who researched the legal consequences of her actions, who took sophisticated steps to avoid detection, and who, when confronted with irrefutable evidence, expressed pride in her methodology rather than remorse for taking her mother's life." Looking directly at the jury, Edwards delivered her final point with quiet intensity. "This case will challenge your assumptions about age and innocence, about technology and its influence on developing minds, and about the evolving nature of family dynamics in the digital age. I ask only that you follow the evidence, particularly the digital trail of deception that Emily Taylor created, to its logical conclusion that she is guilty of the premeditated murder of her mother, regardless of her age or her motive. Defense attorney Sharon Mitchell approached her opening statement with equal gravity but a markedly different tone, beginning by placing a framed photograph of Emily at age 10, smiling broadly in a soccer uniform beside her mother, on a display easel facing the jury. 3 years ago, Emily Taylor was this child, happy, engaged, connected to her mother in the way all children should be. Mitchell allowed a moment for the jury to absorb the image before continuing. Something changed in the Taylor household, something that transformed a loving mother-daughter relationship into a battlefield where digital access became the territory under constant dispute. The prosecution has presented Emily's actions as calculated and cold-blooded. The defense will show you a different reality, a child whose developing brain became profoundly dependent on digital connection, to whom the threat of technological isolation represented an existential crisis rather than a routine discipline. Mitchell's opening strategy focused on contextualizing Emily's actions within a broader societal failure to understand the psychological impact of digital technology on developing minds. We have created a generation for whom constant connectivity is not a luxury but a fundamental part of identity formation, she argued, pacing slowly before the jury box. When Melissa Taylor threatened to completely cut her daughter off from this essential part of her self-concept, she unknowingly triggered a neurological panic response equivalent to a survival threat. The defense attorney was careful not to directly justify Emily's actions, while still suggesting that her capacity for adult-level decision-making had been compromised by both her age and what Mitchell termed technology-dependent identity syndrome, a controversial concept that had emerged in recent psychological literature but had not yet been widely accepted by mainstream psychiatric organizations. Addressing the GPS tracking evidence directly, Mitchell conceded many of the basic facts while reframing their interpretation. Yes, Emily used technology to attempt to create a false alibi. Yes, she researched methods of staging a crime scene and evading detection. These actions demonstrate not cold-blooded premeditation, as the prosecution suggests, but the desperate attempts of an adolescent brain to protect what it perceived as necessary for psychological survival. Mitchell introduced the defense's expert witnesses who would testify about adolescent brain development, the impact of technology on identity formation, and the fight-or-flight response triggered by threats to core identity elements. The science of juvenile neurology is clear, she told the jury. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, consequence evaluation, and moral reasoning, is not fully developed until the mid-20s. Emily Taylor's actions, however disturbing, must be understood in the context of a neurologically immature brain reacting to what it perceived as an existential threat. Mitchell concluded with an emotional appeal that brought several jurors to visible discomfort. 2 lives have already been lost in this tragedy, Melissa Taylor's through death, and Emily's through circumstances that transformed a normal adolescent into a defendant in an adult murder trial. I ask you not to compound this tragedy by judging a 14-year-old's actions through the lens of adult reasoning and moral development. Returning to the photograph of younger Emily, Mitchell added, "This child still exists within the defendant, a child who deserves rehabilitation and understanding rather than vengeance disguised as justice. The evidence will show that while Emily Taylor caused her mother's death, her capacity to form the adult-level intent necessary for first-degree murder was compromised by both her neurological development and the psychologically addictive nature of the technology that had become fundamental to her sense of self." As the opening statements concluded, Judge Hernandez instructed the jury on their responsibilities before calling a recess for lunch. In the courthouse hallway, legal analysts for various media outlets immediately began dissecting the contrasting narratives presented by the prosecution and defense. Edwards has constructed a narrative of cold calculation centered around the GPS evidence, noted legal commentator Maria Vasquez for a local news station. Mitchell is attempting to reframe that same evidence as proof of adolescent desperation rather than adult premeditation. The question is whether the jury will view Emily Taylor primarily as a calculating killer who happens to be young, or as a child whose actions, however terrible, reflect developmental limitations rather than true criminal intent. This framing would define the battle lines for a trial that would not only determine Emily Taylor's fate, but potentially influence how the judicial system approached cases involving juvenile offenders in an increasingly digital world. When court resumed that afternoon, Prosecutor Edwards called her first witness, medical examiner Dr. Amelia Wong, who testified about the cause and manner of Melissa Taylor's death. Using clinical language supplemented by carefully edited autopsy photographs, Dr. Wong established that Melissa had died from a single gunshot wound to the head, fired from close range in a downward trajectory consistent with the shooter standing behind the seated victim. The bullet had entered above the right temple, traversed the brain, and exited through the left side of the skull, causing instantaneous death. Wong testified that the position and angle of the wound, combined with the lack of defensive injuries, suggested Melissa had been unaware of the threat behind her, consistent with being shot by someone she trusted and had no reason to fear. This testimony established the foundation of the state's case, that Melissa had been killed not during a confrontation, but in a moment of vulnerability by someone she had no reason to suspect intended her harm. The prosecution's second witness, crime scene technician Javier Rodriguez, introduced the jury to what would become the centerpiece of the state's case: the smartphone found next to Melissa's body that contained the GPS tracking evidence. Rodriguez methodically walked through the processing of the crime scene, using photographs and digital recreations to show the position of Melissa's body relative to key evidence items, particularly the smartphone. "When I picked up the phone to bag it as evidence, I noticed something unusual," he testified. "The location services icon was active, and when I looked at the screen, it showed the device was at an address across town, not at the crime scene where I was physically holding it." This observation had triggered Rodriguez's suspicion about location spoofing, leading to the digital forensics investigation that would uncover Emily's elaborate attempt to create a false alibi, the digital trail of deception that formed the backbone of the prosecution's case against her. As the first day of testimony concluded, the battle lines in the case of the state of Florida versus Emily Taylor had been clearly drawn. The prosecution had begun building a narrative of cold, calculated murder facilitated by technology and motivated by a teenager's inability to accept parental authority over her digital life. The defense had acknowledged the basic facts while reframing them within a context of adolescent neurodevelopment and technology-dependent identity formation. Both sides recognized that the GPS tracking evidence, Emily's sophisticated attempt to create a false digital alibi, would be the fulcrum on which the case balanced. As jurors filed out of the courtroom, several glanced at Emily, who sat with perfect posture at the defense table, her expression carefully neutral, betraying none of the emotions that might be expected from a 14-year-old on trial for her life. The contrast between her youthful appearance and her composed demeanor created a cognitive dissonance that both legal teams understood would influence the jury's perception throughout the proceedings. A tension between seeing Emily as a child deserving protection or as a calculating killer who had used technology not just to take her mother's life, but to attempt to escape accountability for doing so. On the seventh day of the trial, Prosecutor Claire Edwards called the witness who would deliver the most technically complex yet decisive testimony in the case against Emily Taylor. Aidan Park, the digital forensics expert who had analyzed the GPS tracking evidence, took the stand dressed in a conservative suit that belied his background in cutting-edge technology. With 15 years of experience spanning positions at the FBI's Cyber Division and the Miami-Dade Police Department's Digital Forensics Unit, Park had testified in over 80 criminal trials involving electronic evidence. Edwards began by establishing Park's credentials before moving to the heart of the prosecution's case, what she had termed the digital trail of deception. Using a specially designed interactive display that allowed him to show side-by-side comparisons of data streams, Park guided the jury through the technical aspects of location spoofing and the multiple digital footprints that had revealed Emily's actual movements on the day of the murder. Location spoofing, Park explained, is the process of falsifying the GPS coordinates reported by an electronic device to make it appear to be somewhere it physically isn't. Using simplified analogies accessible to jurors of varying technical literacy, he described how Emily had installed an application designed to override her smartphone's actual location data with coordinates corresponding to her friend Amber's house. This technology was originally developed for legitimate purposes: software testing, privacy protection, gaming, applications that rely on location data. But in this case, it was employed specifically to create a false alibi. Park demonstrated how the spoofing application worked, showing the jury the user interface Emily had interacted with to set false coordinates beginning at 4:30 on the afternoon of the murder, precisely the time she had claimed to have arrived at Amber's house, though multiple other data sources proved she was actually at her own home until after 7:10 that evening. The most powerful aspect of Park's testimony came when he revealed what he called the digital contradiction that had ultimately exposed Emily's deception. While GPS data can be spoofed relatively easily, he explained, modern smartphones collect location information from multiple sources beyond just GPS satellites, cell tower connections, Wi-Fi networks, Bluetooth interactions, barometric pressure readings for elevation changes, and motion sensors that track physical movement. Using color-coded timelines displayed on the courtroom screens, Park showed how Emily's attempt to falsify her location had created a technological contradiction. Her phone's GPS coordinates showed it at Amber's house, while simultaneously cell tower data placed it near her own home. Wi-Fi logs showed it connected to her home network, and the phone's health application recorded movement patterns consistent with someone moving around the Taylor residence. What makes this evidence particularly compelling, Park testified, is that these secondary location indicators aren't commonly known to most users and are significantly more difficult to falsify than primary GPS coordinates. He described how Emily's Google account had automatically logged her actual location through services running in the background of her device, services that continued to track her true movements even while the spoofing application was active. The phone's accelerometer and gyroscope recorded movement patterns consistent with someone walking up and down stairs multiple times between 6:15 and 7:10, matching the layout of the Taylor home, not the single-story Collins residence where Emily claimed to be. This level of detail, Park explained, created an irrefutable digital fingerprint, placing Emily at the scene during the critical time window when her mother was killed. Park's testimony became even more damaging when he revealed evidence of what he called digital premeditation, Emily's methodical research into and testing of the location spoofing technology. The defendant's laptop contained browsing history showing she had researched location spoofing methods beginning 3 weeks before the murder, coinciding with the first time her mother had confiscated her phone as discipline. Using forensically recovered data from Emily's devices, Park demonstrated how she had installed the spoofing application, conducted research on its detection limitations, and performed a practice run 1 week before the murder, using the technology to create a false digital alibi while visiting a pawn shop to inquire about purchasing an untraceable weapon. This wasn't experimental or spontaneous use of technology, Park concluded. This was systematic research, testing, and implementation of a digital deception strategy designed specifically to establish an alibi for a premeditated crime. The technical aspects of Park's testimony were reinforced by his analysis of Emily's search history in the weeks leading up to the murder. Using a chronological display of queries extracted from her devices and cloud accounts, he showed an evolving pattern of research that progressed from dealing with controlling parents to specific searches about methods of killing, evidence concealment, and criminal defense strategies. On February 12th, 3 weeks before the murder, the defendant searched, "Can teenagers get the death penalty in Florida?" Park testified. On February 19th, she researched, "How long does DNA last at crime scenes?" On February 27th, she searched, "How to stage a break-in and do police check internet history in murder cases." This progression, Park explained, demonstrated not just passing curiosity, but a sustained, methodical gathering of information specifically related to planning a homicide and evading detection, information that culminated in her sophisticated attempt to create a false digital alibi through GPS spoofing. During cross-examination, defense attorney Sharon Mitchell attempted to recontextualize Park's testimony by suggesting alternative explanations for Emily's digital activities. "Mr. Park, isn't it true that teenagers today often research disturbing topics out of curiosity rather than intent?" she asked. "Haven't studies shown that morbid search patterns are common among adolescents exploring identity and boundaries?" Park acknowledged that teenagers' search patterns often included topics adults might find concerning, but maintained that the specific progression, timing, and focused nature of Emily's searches distinguished them from typical adolescent curiosity. "These weren't random queries," he testified. "They formed a logical sequence of information gathering for a specific purpose, culminating in the actual implementation of the techniques researched." Mitchell's attempts to characterize Emily's digital activities as exploration rather than preparation gained little traction against Park's methodical presentation of the evidence. Mitchell's cross-examination strategy shifted to questioning whether the GPS evidence truly demonstrated premeditation rather than panic after an impulsive act. "Isn't it possible, Mr. Park, that Emily activated the location spoofing application after an unplanned confrontation turned violent, attempting to cover up an impulsive action rather than executing a premeditated plan?" Park's response effectively foreclosed this alternative narrative. The digital evidence contradicts that possibility. The spoofing application was activated at 4:20, nearly 2 hours before Dr. Taylor returned home, and at least 2.5 hours before her death. Furthermore, Emily sent text messages from the spoofed location to her mother at 4:45, establishing a digital trail showing her supposedly at her friend's house while her mother was still at work. This testimony, delivered with the quiet confidence of technical expertise, undermined one of the defense's primary alternative theories and reinforced the prosecution's narrative of calculated premeditation. The defense's final approach during cross-examination attempted to introduce reasonable doubt by suggesting that the digital evidence, while compelling, couldn't definitively prove Emily had pulled the trigger. "Mr. Park, for all its sophistication, does this digital trail actually show us the moment of the shooting? Does it prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Emily Taylor, rather than some other person, fired the gun that killed her mother?" Park acknowledged the limitation inherent in digital evidence. The GPS data and associated digital footprints place Emily at the scene during the time window when the murder occurred. They demonstrate her attempts to create a false alibi and her extensive preparation. They do not, in themselves, capture the actual moment of the shooting. This concession offered a momentary opening for the defense, but Park's redirect examination by Prosecutor Edwards quickly closed it. Based on the totality of the digital evidence, Emily's research into murder methods, her preparation of a false alibi, her documented presence at the scene, and her possession of the murder weapon when apprehended, is there any reasonable alternative explanation for the data patterns you've analyzed? Park's response was unequivocal. None that is consistent with all the digital evidence. Following Park's testimony, the prosecution called Detective Marcus Johnson to the stand to integrate the digital evidence with the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene. Johnson methodically walked the jury through the investigation, explaining how Emily's fingerprints had been found on the gun safe on surfaces throughout the staged break-in scene, and on the patio door glass broken from inside rather than outside. He testified about the recovery of the silicone cast of Melissa's fingerprint that Emily had created to access the biometric gun safe, the gunshot residue found on a sweatshirt hidden in Emily's closet, and the murder weapon discovered in her backpack when she was apprehended at Amber's house. Every piece of physical evidence, Johnson concluded, aligned perfectly with the digital trail documented by Mr. Park. The GPS tracking evidence gave us the why and the how. The physical evidence confirmed the who beyond any reasonable doubt. The most emotionally charged testimony came from Amber Collins, Emily's friend who had initially provided a false alibi before revealing the truth to investigators. Visibly nervous on the stand, the 16-year-old described how Emily had manipulated her into agreeing to lie about their whereabouts on the evening of the murder. She had been asking me hypothetical questions for weeks, like, "Would you cover for me no matter what?" And, "If I needed an alibi, could I count on you?" Amber testified. "I thought it was just talk, maybe about skipping school or something, not this." She described Emily's arrival at her house shortly after 7:30 on the night of the murder, not 4:30, as they had initially claimed to police, and Emily's insistence that they maintain the false timeline. When I saw the news about Dr. Taylor's murder later that night, I asked Emily directly if she had done it, Amber said, her voice breaking. She just looked at me really calmly and said, "They can't prove anything if you stick to the story." The prosecution's case culminated with testimony from psychiatrist Dr. Eleanor Patel, who had evaluated Emily and rejected the defense's claims of diminished capacity due to technology addiction or adolescent brain development. While it's true that the teenage brain is still developing, particularly in areas related to impulse control and consequence evaluation, Dr. Patel testified, Emily's actions demonstrated sophisticated planning, awareness of consequences, and deliberate attempts to evade detection, all indicators of knowing, intentional behavior rather than impulsive reaction. Dr. Patel directly addressed the defense's theory about technology dependency, stating that her evaluation found no evidence that Emily's relationship with technology constituted a clinical addiction or compromised her ability to distinguish right from wrong. Instead, Dr. Patel suggested, the evidence pointed to a disturbing prioritization of digital access over human life and moral boundaries, a value distortion rather than a cognitive impairment. As the prosecution rested its case, the weight of the evidence, particularly the GPS tracking evidence that had revealed Emily's elaborate digital deception, hung heavily in the courtroom. The defense would present its own experts on adolescent psychology and technology dependency, but the comprehensive digital trail documented by Aidan Park had established a narrative difficult to reframe. A 14-year-old girl had researched, planned, and executed her mother's murder over a confiscated smartphone, then attempted to create a sophisticated false alibi using technology she believed would protect her from consequences. The jurors' faces reflected the cognitive dissonance at the heart of the case, reconciling Emily's youth and apparent normalcy with the calculated nature of her actions as revealed through the digital evidence. As court adjourned for the day, legal analysts covering the trial suggested that the GPS tracking evidence had transformed what might have been portrayed as an impulsive teenage reaction into an undeniable case of premeditated murder, regardless of the defendant's age or the seemingly trivial nature of her motive. After 14 days of testimony and nearly 70 witnesses, the state of Florida versus Emily Taylor moved to its final phase as both legal teams prepared to deliver their closing arguments. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with a line of spectators and media representatives stretching down the courthouse hallway, all drawn by a case that had captured national attention and sparked fierce debates about juvenile justice, parental authority in the digital age, and the psychological impact of technology on developing minds. Outside the courthouse, demonstrators from opposing advocacy groups held signs reflecting the polarized public response: "Children are not adults," and "Justice for Melissa," competing for visibility as news cameras captured the scene. Inside, Emily Taylor sat at the defense table in a pale blue dress selected to emphasize her youth, her expression carefully composed as it had been throughout the trial, betraying none of the anxiety typically visible in defendants awaiting their fate. Prosecutor Claire Edwards approached the jury for her closing argument with a quiet intensity that commanded attention without theatrics. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "over the past 2 weeks you have heard overwhelming evidence that Emily Taylor methodically planned and executed the murder of her mother, Dr. Melissa Taylor, because she could not accept the temporary loss of her smartphone." Edwards moved to a display screen showing the timeline of Emily's digital activities leading up to the murder. This is not a case about a momentary lapse in judgment or an adolescent's inability to control impulses. This is a case about premeditation in its most calculated form, researching methods of killing, practicing the use of location spoofing technology to create a false alibi, preparing a silicone cast of her mother's fingerprint to access the gun safe, and ultimately executing a plan that included not just the murder itself, but sophisticated attempts to evade justice. Edwards paused, allowing the jury to absorb the weight of this summary before continuing. "The evidence has shown beyond any reasonable doubt that Emily Taylor's actions were knowing, intentional, and premeditated, the very definition of first-degree murder." Edwards devoted a significant portion of her closing argument to what had become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, the GPS tracking evidence and the digital trail of deception it revealed. Expert testimony has demonstrated that Emily Taylor didn't just kill her mother, she created an elaborate digital alibi designed to make it appear she was miles away at the time of the murder. Using visual aids prepared by digital forensics expert Aidan Park, Edwards walked the jury through the parallel timelines of Emily's actual movements and the false location data generated by the spoofing application. This wasn't an afterthought or a panicked attempt to cover up an impulsive act. This was premeditation in its most literal sense, preparing before the act with the specific intent to commit murder and evade detection. Edwards argued that the sophistication of Emily's digital deception actually undermined the defense's claims about adolescent brain development and diminished capacity. These are not the actions of someone unable to understand consequences or control impulses. These are the actions of someone who understood precisely what she was doing and took calculated steps to avoid being held accountable. Addressing the defense's arguments about technology addiction and identity formation, Edwards acknowledged the changing landscape of adolescent development while rejecting its relevance to criminal responsibility. We can recognize that technology plays a different role in young people's lives today without accepting that dependence on digital devices somehow justifies or mitigates the taking of a human life, she argued. Many teenagers face temporary loss of phone privileges as a consequence for behavior. They don't respond by researching murder methods, creating fingerprint casts to access gun safes, and shooting their parents in the head. Edwards reminded the jury of Dr. Eleanor Patel's testimony that Emily's relationship with technology represented a disturbing prioritization of digital access over human life, rather than a clinically significant addiction that would impair her decision-making capacity. The evidence shows not diminished capacity, Edwards concluded this portion of her argument, but a profound moral distortion that valued constant digital connection above her mother's very life. The prosecutor concluded with a direct appeal to the jury's responsibility to render a verdict based on evidence rather than emotion or broader social concerns about juvenile justice. Emily Taylor's age is a fact, but it does not change the other facts established by overwhelming evidence that she deliberately killed her mother, that she did so with premeditation and calculation, and that she took sophisticated steps to avoid detection and create a false alibi. Edwards' voice softened slightly as she addressed the tragedy at the heart of the case. Melissa Taylor will never see her daughter grow up, never celebrate another birthday, never achieve another professional milestone, or experience another moment of joy. Her life was cut short, not by illness or accident, but by the deliberate action of the person she had devoted her life to nurturing and protecting. Looking directly at the jury, Edwards delivered her final words. The evidence in this case supports only one verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Justice for Melissa Taylor demands nothing less. Defense attorney Sharon Mitchell approached her closing argument with equal gravity, but a markedly different focus, beginning by placing the case in a broader social context. This trial is not just about what happened in the Taylor home on March 7th, she told the jury. It is about how we as a society understand and respond to the profound changes in adolescent development brought about by immersive digital technology. Mitchell acknowledged the undisputed facts of the case while reframing their interpretation. Emily Taylor caused her mother's death. She attempted to create a false alibi using location spoofing technology. She researched methods of concealing evidence. None of these facts are in dispute. What is in dispute is whether these actions reflect the kind of knowing, mature intent required for a first-degree murder conviction, or whether they represent the desperate, neurologically immature response of an adolescent brain perceiving an existential threat to its core identity. Mitchell built her argument around testimony from the defense's expert witnesses on adolescent neurology and technology psychology. The science is clear, she argued, that the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for impulse control, consequence evaluation, and moral reasoning, is not fully developed until the mid-20s. This is not an excuse. It is a biological reality that the law must acknowledge. Using brain scan images introduced during expert testimony, Mitchell illustrated the structural differences between adolescent and adult brains, particularly in regions associated with decision-making under emotional stress. Emily Taylor's brain was and is physiologically incapable of the same level of reasoned judgment we expect from adults, particularly in situations involving emotional triggers related to core identity elements, which, for her generation, centrally includes digital connectivity. Mitchell suggested that Emily's extensive planning actually reflected her neurological immaturity rather than adult-level premeditation. The elaborate nature of her preparations demonstrates not cold calculation, but the desperate over-planning typical of adolescents lacking the neurological capacity to properly evaluate risk and proportion. The defense's most compelling argument centered on what Mitchell termed the the digital identity crisis at the heart of the case. For Melissa Taylor's generation, a smartphone was a convenient tool acquired in adulthood. For Emily's generation, digital connectivity is the primary medium through which identity itself is formed and maintained. Mitchell cited testimony from digital psychology expert Dr. Rebecca Zhang about the neurological impact of smartphone deprivation on adolescents raised with constant connectivity. Dr. Zhang explained that brain scans of teenagers experiencing digital deprivation show activity patterns similar to those suffering physical pain or severe social rejection. When Emily was told she would lose her phone indefinitely, her developing brain processed this not as a routine discipline, but as a catastrophic threat to her core identity. This framing attempted to contextualize Emily's extreme response without justifying it, suggesting her actions reflected a profound developmental vulnerability rather than malicious intent. Mitchell directly addressed the GPS tracking evidence that had formed the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, offering an alternative interpretation. The digital trail of deception that Prosecutor Edwards has emphasized so heavily actually supports our contention about Emily's developmental limitations. An adult planning the perfect crime would understand that digital evidence extends far beyond simple GPS location data. Emily's belief that spoofing her phone's GPS coordinates would create an unassailable alibi demonstrates the limitations of adolescent planning abilities, not sophisticated adult calculation. This reframing sought to transform what the prosecution had presented as evidence of premeditation into support for the defense's argument about Emily's neurological immaturity and limited capacity for adult-level reasoning. As she concluded her argument, Mitchell acknowledged the tragedy of Melissa Taylor's death while appealing to the jury to consider the appropriate legal response. Nothing we decide here will bring Dr. Taylor back to life or undo the terrible events of March 7th, but we can ensure that our response reflects an understanding of adolescent development and the unprecedented challenges facing young people in the digital age. Mitchell urged the jury to consider a verdict of second-degree murder or manslaughter, arguing that these charges better reflected Emily's actual mental state and developmental capacity. Justice in this case must account for both the tragedy of Melissa Taylor's death and the reality that the defendant's actions occurred through the lens of an immature brain responding to what it perceived as an existential threat. The law recognizes these distinctions for a reason, because justice requires understanding context, not just consequences. After receiving detailed instructions from Judge Hernandez on the legal definitions of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter, the jury began deliberations late on the afternoon of June 26th. Legal analysts predicted lengthy deliberations given the complexity of the case and the difficult questions it raised about adolescent culpability. But at 10:17 the following morning, after just 7 hours of discussion, the jury notified the court it had reached a verdict. As the courtroom settled into a tense silence, Emily Taylor stood between her attorneys, her posture rigid and her face expressionless, as the jury foreperson rose to deliver the verdict. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Emily Taylor, guilty. A collective gasp swept through the gallery, followed by muffled sobs from Melissa's family members seated in the front row. Emily herself showed no visible reaction to the verdict, her expression remaining as composed as it had been throughout the trial, a flatness that many observers found more disturbing than any emotional display would have been. Judge Richard Hernandez scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, ordering a comprehensive pre-sentencing investigation that would include psychological evaluations, victim impact statements, and an analysis of Emily's potential for rehabilitation. The intervening period saw intense media coverage and public debate about appropriate sentencing for juvenile offenders convicted as adults, with legal experts predicting a sentence ranging from 25 years to life imprisonment. Advocacy groups on both sides mobilized supporters to send thousands of letters to the court, some arguing for the maximum possible penalty to send a message about the sanctity of human life, others urging leniency based on Emily's age and the evolving understanding of adolescent brain development. Social media platforms became battlegrounds for competing hashtags, Justice for Melissa and Emily's Not an Adult, trending simultaneously as the case catalyzed broader societal conversations about parental authority, digital dependency, and juvenile justice reform. On July 19th, Emily Taylor returned to Courtroom 3A for sentencing, the proceeding broadcast live on local television and streamed nationally due to the unprecedented public interest in the case. Victim impact statements from Melissa Taylor's family, colleagues, and patients painted a devastating portrait of loss. A brilliant physician whose compassionate care had saved countless children, a devoted daughter who had supported her aging parents, a loyal friend whose absence left an unfillable void in many lives. Melissa's sister, Maria Rodriguez, addressed Emily directly in her statement. "You didn't just take my sister's life, you took a healer from this world, someone who dedicated her life to saving children. The irony that she was killed by the child she loved most is a pain beyond words." Throughout these emotional testimonies, Emily sat motionless at the defense table, her affect flat, showing none of the remorse or distress that might have influenced the judge toward leniency. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Emily rose and delivered a statement that shocked even those who had followed the case closely. Speaking in a clear, steady voice that betrayed no emotion, she said, "I understand that social norms expect me to express remorse, but I believe authenticity is more appropriate than performance. I recognize that killing my mother was illegal and has resulted in significant disruption to multiple lives, including my own. I miscalculated the likelihood of digital evidence exposing my actions, which was an error in judgment I would not repeat." This clinical, emotionally detached statement focused entirely on the technical failure of her plan, rather than the moral implications of taking her mother's life. Visibly disturbed the many in the courtroom, including several jurors who had returned to witness the sentencing. Emily concluded with what appeared to be her only genuine concern. "I would request, if possible, educational access to current technology during my incarceration, as remaining digitally illiterate would constitute additional punishment beyond the sentence itself." Judge Hernandez's sentencing decision, delivered after a 30-minute recess during which he reviewed all pre-sentencing materials, would become as controversial as the case itself. "Emily Taylor," he began, his voice grave, "you have been convicted of the premeditated murder of your mother, Dr. Melissa Taylor, a crime that demonstrates not just a disregard for human life, but a profound moral distortion that the court finds deeply disturbing. The evidence presented at trial established beyond any doubt that you researched, planned, and executed this killing with calculation and forethought, then attempted to create a sophisticated false alibi using technology you believed would protect you from consequences." The judge addressed the defense's arguments about adolescent brain development directly. While the court acknowledges the ongoing scientific understanding of juvenile neurology, your actions demonstrated a level of planning and awareness of consequences that cannot be dismissed as mere developmental limitation. Moreover, your statement today confirms what the evidence suggested throughout this trial, that you lack the fundamental human empathy and moral reasoning that form the foundation of our social contract. Judge Hernandez then delivered a sentence that would make headlines across the country: 135 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole review only after a minimum of 60 years served. This sentence, he explained, reflects not just the premeditated taking of a human life, but the cold calculation evidenced by your elaborate digital deception, your exploitation of your mother's trust, and your complete absence of remorse or moral comprehension of your actions. The judge directly referenced the GPS tracking evidence in his justification. Your sophisticated attempt to create a false alibi through location spoofing technology demonstrates both premeditation and a disturbing pride in your own technical cleverness, a pride that appears to have outweighed any consideration of the human life you were taking. The sentence, effectively life imprisonment for a 14-year-old defendant, immediately sparked outcry from juvenile justice advocates who called it medieval and a denial of the possibility of rehabilitation, while victims' rights organizations praised it as appropriate recognition of the calculated nature of the crime regardless of the perpetrator's age. The immediate aftermath of the sentencing saw Emily Taylor transferred to a juvenile detention facility where she would remain until her 18th birthday, after which she would be moved to an adult women's prison to serve the remainder of her sentence. Her defense team immediately filed notice of appeal, challenging both the adult prosecution of a 14-year-old defendant and the constitutionality of a de facto life sentence for a juvenile offender. Legal experts predicted years of appeals that might eventually reach the Supreme Court, potentially establishing new precedents for juvenile sentencing in the digital age. Meanwhile, Emily herself reportedly adjusted to detention with the same emotional detachment she had displayed throughout her trial, requesting access to educational materials about technology advancement and expressing concern primarily about falling behind in digital literacy during her incarceration rather than the decades of imprisonment that lay ahead of her. Public reaction to the case remained deeply divided, reflecting broader societal tensions about technology, parenting, and juvenile justice. Editorials in major newspapers debated whether Emily Taylor represented a disturbing anomaly or a warning sign about a generation raised with digital dependency as a core element of identity formation. Psychology journals published special issues examining the potential relationship between constant connectivity and moral development in adolescence. Parent groups organized workshops on monitoring children's digital activities and recognizing warning signs of unhealthy technology attachment. The case became a reference point in legislative debates about juvenile justice reform, with advocates on both sides citing Emily Taylor as either evidence of the need for rehabilitation-focused approaches to young offenders or proof that some crimes transcend age in their calculation and moral gravity. Perhaps the most poignant reaction came from David Taylor, Emily's father and Melissa's ex-husband, who broke his public silence in an interview 6 weeks after the sentencing. "I lost my entire family in a single moment of madness that I still cannot comprehend," he said, visibly struggling with emotion. Melissa was a remarkable woman and an extraordinary mother who did everything possible to help Emily navigate the challenges of adolescence. That her reward for this dedication was to be killed over something as trivial as a confiscated phone is a tragedy that defies understanding. Asked about his daughter's sentence, David offered a perspective that captured the irreconcilable tensions at the heart of the case. "As a father, I cannot abandon hope that the child I once knew still exists somewhere inside Emily and might someday understand the magnitude of what she's done. As Melissa's former husband, I cannot deny that the calculated nature of her killing deserves the severest consequences. I live in this impossible space between grief for my murdered ex-wife and grief for my imprisoned daughter, a purgatory with no resolution." 3 years after Emily Taylor's sentencing, her case continued to reverberate through the American legal system, influencing policy debates, judicial decisions, and public discourse about juvenile justice in the digital age. The Taylor case had become a landmark in jurisprudence, cited in dozens of subsequent trials, involving juvenile offenders and digital evidence, with judges and attorneys from across the country referring to the GPS tracking evidence standard established during Emily's prosecution. Her appeal, initially filed on grounds that the adult prosecution and effective life sentence for a 14-year-old defendant constituted cruel and unusual punishment, had worked its way through the Florida appellate court system with mixed results. The Florida Supreme Court upheld both her conviction and the adult prosecution decision, but ordered a resentencing hearing to consider whether the 135-year sentence violated recent Supreme Court precedents regarding juvenile life sentences. This partial victory for Emily's defense team ensured that her case would continue to shape the evolving legal standards for juvenile offenders, while keeping her story in the public consciousness long after the initial media frenzy had subsided. The Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office had created a specialized digital evidence prosecution unit in direct response to the Taylor case, recognizing that traditional investigative methods needed to evolve to address crimes involving sophisticated technological elements. Prosecutor Claire Edwards, who had successfully tried the case against Emily, now headed this unit, training law enforcement agencies across Florida on digital forensics and evidence collection protocols. The Taylor case demonstrated both the complexity of modern digital evidence and its power in establishing timelines, motives, and premeditation, Edwards explained in a Law Enforcement Journal interview. What began as a curious anomaly, a smartphone showing false location data, expanded into the most comprehensive digital trail I've seen in my career, ultimately proving not just that Emily was physically present at the murder scene, but that she had methodically planned both the killing and her attempted evasion of justice. The protocols developed during the investigation had been formalized into best practices now taught at police academies nationwide, with the GPS tracking evidence methodology becoming standard procedure in homicide investigations involving digital devices. Emily herself remained incarcerated at the Florida Juvenile Correctional Facility for Girls, where she would stay until her 18th birthday before transfer to an adult women's prison. Reports from correctional officers and educational staff described her as a model inmate in terms of behavioral compliance, but noted her continued emotional detachment and lack of expressed remorse. The facility's head psychologist, Dr. James Willis, had published a peer-reviewed case study with identifying details, altered to protect confidentiality, describing what he termed digital identity dissociation syndrome, a condition in which individuals raised with constant connectivity developed a self-concept so intertwined with their online presence that separation triggered dissociative responses. Willis's work, while controversial in the psychiatric community, had sparked renewed research interest in the psychological impacts of technology on developing brains, with multiple universities launching longitudinal studies examining correlations between early digital immersion and moral development, empathy formation, and impulse regulation in adolescence. The Taylor case had also profoundly influenced parenting approaches and educational policies regarding technology usage among children and teenagers. School districts across the country had implemented new guidelines for managing digital device usage, with many adopting what became known as the Taylor Protocol, a structured approach to confiscating and returning devices that included clear timelines, cooling-off periods, and psychological support resources. Parent education programs had expanded to include modules on recognizing unhealthy technology attachment and strategies for implementing digital boundaries without triggering extreme reactions. These efforts reflected a growing recognition that traditional disciplinary approaches developed before ubiquitous connectivity might require recalibration for a generation whose identity formation occurred substantially through digital mediums, a recognition that came too late for Melissa Taylor, but that her death had catalyzed across American society. Perhaps the most significant legacy of the case emerged through the work of the Melissa Taylor Foundation, established by Melissa's sister, Maria Rodriguez, and colleagues from Miami Children's Hospital to address the intersection of adolescent mental health and technology use. The foundation funded research, developed educational resources for parents and schools, and advocated for balanced approaches to digital boundaries that recognized both the potential harms of unrestricted access and the psychological importance of connectivity to modern teenagers. Melissa would have wanted something constructive to come from this tragedy, Rodriguez explained at the foundation's launch. As a pediatrician, she was deeply concerned about finding the right balance between appropriate limits and acknowledging the reality of how today's young people form and maintain their social connections. The Foundation's annual conference had become a gathering point for psychologists, educators, technology ethicists, and policymakers working to develop evidence-based approaches to adolescent digital citizenship, a collaborative effort to prevent future tragedies stemming from the same disconnection between parental authority and teenage digital identity that had culminated in Melissa's murder. The Taylor home in Miami had been sold, the proceeds divided between Melissa's estate and a victims' compensation fund, with the new owners completely renovating the property to remove any visible reminders of the tragedy that had occurred there. The neighborhood had slowly recovered from the shock and media attention, though residents acknowledged that the case had permanently altered their sense of security and community. "We used to think that wealth and education insulated us from this kind of violence," one neighbor told a documentary filmmaker working on a 5-year retrospective about the case. "Now we understand that the digital generation gap creates vulnerabilities in every household, regardless of socioeconomic status." This recognition had led to the formation of parent support networks throughout the affluent Miami suburb, with families working collectively to establish consistent digital boundaries across peer groups, an approach designed to prevent the isolation and resentment that individual restrictions could trigger in digitally dependent teenagers. The legal debate surrounding juvenile sentencing in cases of premeditated violence continued to evolve, with Emily's case frequently cited by advocates on both sides of the issue. Youth justice organizations pointed to emerging neuroscience about adolescent brain development to argue that even calculated crimes committed by teenagers deserved consideration of their developmental limitations and potential for rehabilitation. Victims' rights groups countered that the sophistication of Emily's planning and her continued lack of remorse demonstrated that some juvenile offenders possessed adult-level capacity for premeditation and moral disengagement, justifying adult-level consequences. This tension played out in legislative hearings across multiple states, considering reforms to juvenile sentencing guidelines, with Emily's case serving as both cautionary tale and call to action for policymakers, wrestling with the appropriate balance between accountability and recognition of developmental factors in adolescent criminal behavior. Emily's resentencing hearing, held 5 years after her original conviction, became another media spectacle, though with a more subdued tone reflecting the distance from the initial shock of the crime. Now 19 and legally an adult, Emily appeared in court noticeably changed from the 14-year-old who had stood trial, taller, her features matured, though still recognizable as the teenager whose case had captivated the nation. Her affect remained controlled, but observers noted subtle shifts in her demeanor, suggesting the beginnings of emotional development that had been starkly absent during her original trial and sentencing. Emily's new legal team presented evidence of her educational achievements while incarcerated, her participation in available therapy programs, and psychiatric evaluations, suggesting emerging capacity for empathy, developments they argued demonstrated potential for rehabilitation that should be reflected in a modified sentence, including the possibility of parole after 25 years rather than 60. The most significant moment in the resentencing hearing came when Emily addressed the court, delivering a statement markedly different from her clinically detached comments 5 years earlier. "I understand now, in ways I couldn't before, the reality of what I took from this world when I killed my mother," she said, her voice steady but with perceptible emotion. "I don't ask for forgiveness, which I haven't earned and may never deserve. I ask only that the court recognize that the person who committed this crime was operating with a fundamentally undeveloped understanding of human connection and mortality, deficits I've begun to address through education and therapy, though the work is far from complete." This statement, analyzed extensively by media commentators and psychiatric experts, represented what one observer called the first glimpse of human recognition in a case previously defined by its absence. Whether this represented genuine moral development or calculated performance remained a subject of debate among those who had followed the case from its beginning. Judge Mariana Vasquez, who presided over the resentencing hearing, ultimately reduced Emily's sentence to 60 years, with eligibility for parole consideration after 30 years, a modification that acknowledged recent Supreme Court guidance on juvenile life sentences while still reflecting the calculated nature of the crime. The court recognizes both emerging science regarding adolescent brain development and the particularly heinous nature of a premeditated matricide executed with digital sophistication, Judge Vasquez explained in her ruling. This modified sentence maintains proportional accountability while acknowledging the possibility, though not the certainty, of meaningful rehabilitation over time. This decision satisfied neither those who had advocated for a complete resentencing in the juvenile system nor those who had argued for maintaining the original sentence, but it established an important precedent for similar cases involving juvenile offenders convicted of premeditated violent crimes. The technological landscape that had facilitated both Emily's crime and her conviction continued to evolve rapidly in the years following her case. Location spoofing applications, central to Emily's attempt to create a false alibi, had become subject to new regulations requiring clear forensic markers when activated, a direct response to the Taylor case championed by digital evidence experts who had witnessed how such technology could be misused to obstruct justice. Smartphone manufacturers had implemented enhanced parental control options, designed to reduce conflict over device access, including graduated restriction protocols and built-in cooling-off mechanisms for both parents and teenagers experiencing technology-related conflicts. These technical solutions represented industry acknowledgement of the psychological realities highlighted by the Taylor case, that digital access had become so fundamental to adolescent identity that restrictions required careful implementation to avoid triggering extreme responses. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the case emerged not through legal or technological changes, but through its influence on cultural understandings of the digital generation gap. The Taylor case had entered the lexicon as shorthand for the potential consequences of failing to bridge this gap, with educators, mental health professionals, and family counselors routinely referencing it when discussing technology management in families. Before Taylor, we treated smartphones primarily as privilege items that could be granted or removed like any other, explained adolescent psychologist Dr. Rebecca Jang. After Taylor, we recognized that for digital natives, these devices represent something fundamentally different, extensions of identity and primary channels for social existence that require nuanced approaches to regulation. This shift in understanding had gradually transformed parental approaches to technology management, with emphasis moving from simple restriction to guided navigation of digital spaces and collaborative establishment of healthy boundaries. 10 years after Melissa Taylor's murder, Miami Children's Hospital dedicated the Melissa Taylor Center for Adolescent Digital Health, a specialized clinic combining medical care, psychological services, and family counseling for teenagers experiencing unhealthy relationships with technology. The center, funded partially by the Melissa Taylor Foundation and partially by state mental health initiatives, embodied the constructive response that had emerged from the tragedy, offering evidence-based interventions for families navigating the complex intersection of adolescent development and digital immersion. Dr. Taylor would have been at the forefront of addressing these issues had she lived, said Dr. James Willis, the center's director and Melissa's former colleague. We honor her memory by creating the resource she would have wanted for her own daughter, a place where the psychological importance of digital connection is acknowledged while healthy boundaries are established through collaboration rather than conflict. Emily Taylor herself remained a cipher at the center of a case that had reshaped juvenile justice approaches to digital evidence and adolescent capacity. Prison records indicated steady academic progress, completion of available therapy programs, and compliance with institutional rules, but offered limited insight into her internal development or genuine understanding of her crime's moral dimensions. Occasional interviews granted to researchers studying juvenile offenders revealed a person gradually developing greater emotional vocabulary and self-awareness while maintaining an analytical perspective on her own case. I recognize now that I value digital connection above human life, she told one researcher in a recorded interview, which represents a fundamental moral failure regardless of age or brain development stage. The challenge I face is not just accepting responsibility for taking my mother's life, but developing the capacity for genuine empathy that might have prevented me from doing so, a capacity that seems to require the human connections I systematically devalued. Whether this represented authentic growth or a strategic adaptation to her circumstances remained impossible to determine conclusively, a final ambiguity in a case that had forced American society to confront uncomfortable questions about technology's role in reshaping adolescent development, family dynamics, and the very nature of identity in the digital age. The Taylor case ultimately left a complex legacy across multiple domains: legal precedent, psychological understanding, parenting approaches, educational policy, and technological development. It had exposed fault lines in the digital generation gap that existed in countless families, revealing the potential for tragedy when parents raised in an analog world attempted to regulate the digital lives of children for whom connectivity represented not just entertainment or convenience, but a fundamental aspect of identity formation and social existence. While no single case could resolve the tensions inherent in this generational transition, Emily Taylor's crime and its aftermath had forced a national reckoning with the need for new frameworks, legal, psychological, and familial, to address the unprecedented challenges of raising children in a world where the boundaries between physical and digital existence had become increasingly permeable. The GPS tracking evidence that had begun as a curious technological anomaly in a murder investigation had expanded into something far more significant, a map of the treacherous terrain families now navigated as they attempted to guide young people through a digital landscape their parents had never experienced as adolescents themselves.